Thank you for having me. So excited to be here. And Jeff, that was an amazing talk. Thank you for that. So I'm going to try to go, so Jeff sort of showed a broad overview of what's possible. And I've been sort of on a quest for the last 5 to 10 years in thinking about how do we take some of this from bench to bedside. So what I'm going to do is do a deeper dive to one example disease area that we've sort of done a long journey in. And to do that, I'll start with an introduction to Mrs. Manny. So Mrs. Manny is 52 years old. She comes to the ED. This is at a hospital in Maryland. She comes with what looks like a sore foot, and she doesn't feel very well. She also doesn't have a whole lot of family support, so the hospital admits her and puts her in a general ward, mostly for monitoring purposes. But turns out 22 days later, what looked like benign, nothing major going on, 22 days later, she died. So the question is, what happened there? So it turns out when she got admitted to the general ward, on day 3, she starts showing signs of what looks like pneumonia. And her care team gives her the typical dose of antibiotics to treat pneumonia, and they think all's good. But then on day 6, she starts showing signs of tachycardia, her heart rhythm's accelerating. On day 7, she experiences what's called septic shock. And now, at this point, it's really clear she's sort of deteriorating very rapidly, so they admit her to the intensive care unit. At the ICU, she gets all the right treatments to the extent, they aggressively treat her, but unfortunately, her kidneys fail, her lungs fail, and then on day 22, she died. Now, the thing with Mrs. Manny is that it's not that people didn't do the right things. She got all the right treatments. The problem was that she just got it too late. And the question, and so in this particular example, essentially what happened is she had an initial infection. It cascaded down, the infection itself started attacking her organ systems. It's cascaded to start causing organ failures, and it didn't get detected in a timely enough way, unfortunately leading to organ failure and death. Now, sepsis is the 11th leading cause of death. It also happens to be kills more people than breast cancer and prostate cancer combined. It's preventable if treated early. Okay, so then what's the hitch? The challenge is that it's extremely hard to recognize early. And this is a study that was done at Harvard, where they got multiple infectious disease experts in a room. They showed them cases, and in general, it was very inter-expert agreement on what is and isn't sepsis. In the early stages of the disease was extremely low. So this is well understood to be a challenging problem. Now, part of it is also the chaos of like Jeff spoke about, the delivery of medicine in its own right. The pressure of delivering medicine is increasing. You're having to see more patients. You're busy trying to digitize your data. You're busy reacting in an environment where there's so many demands on your time that even if a person was subtly deteriorating, the chance that you would be constantly vigilant and would discover it is really hard. So I unfortunately lost my nephew to sepsis, so that was another reason that motivated me to go down this path. And so early research in this direction has shown that it's possible actually to identify sepsis early. And so classically, people had thought about trying to create tests that where you basically do a blood draw and then you look for markers in blood. And so around 2012-ish, we started asking this question, and more broadly in the field, people started asking this question, which is, we showed that basically by integrating many diverse markers like labs and physiology, while you may not see any glaring sign for a single marker, you can actually integrate these diverse signs, much like Jeff was alluding to in his talk, in order to be able to identify sepsis early. And sepsis early in a way that's really exciting. So, much earlier than standard of care, much earlier than physicians currently recognize, much prior to any organ dysfunction, so it's actually possible to resuscitate this individual more easily. And then also, many more individuals were being recognized than, and these are all numbers compared to Muse, which is sort of one example, severity assessment that's used to do to determine. So today, for the rest of the talk, what I'm going to talk about is sort of, if I'm here to talk about AI, I have to talk about the cool, because I cannot talk about the cool. So it's going to be 3 parts. So the first part is just a little bit of the cool, like a little bit of a glimpse into how AI learns from data. And there are many, many ways to learn from data. So what does using AI mean? Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is the hard bits. What does it take? What are the fundamental challenges you have to, kinds of fundamental challenges we have to be solving to take it to practice? And then the third is, so what? Why is this exciting? So let's start with the cool. So for those of you who haven't worked, we constantly hear about like you take a model and then you put some data and then out comes some AUC. So I just want to sort of go one level deeper, like in an intuitive level of what's going on. So intuitive level, for those of you who haven't worked in AI or machine learning, think of it as like, I'm going to draw like a human analogy here. So imagine you were learning how to walk, and your goal was to be able to walk without falling, and you want to be able to walk as long as possible. And so the first thing you'd have to do is, in order to be able to do that, is you need to set up like a goal, right? Your goal is to be able to walk as long as possible without falling. And in order, now that you have a goal, the point is you have to express the goal in order to teach a machine how to walk, just like you would teach, humans learn how to play a game, and you learn how to win at that game. Here in this case, so the goal needs to be specified in a language that the machine can understand. And turns out machines understand math really well. So we write out the math, and obviously this isn't quite exactly the right objective function, but approximately it's the idea like using math. You can write out an objective function. And now once you have an objective function, then what do we do? So once we're playing a game, what do? We experiment, right? We try this, we try that, we try this, we try that, and we see what works, right? So here in the same case, if you were learning how to walk, in order to teach a robot to walk, we'd basically experiment with different moves. And so you'd say, should I try this move? And should I try that move? And each time I try something, I'd get a score. And score is essentially, am I headed in the right direction or am I not? In mathematical terms, this is the equivalent of what's called the gradient function. And it tells you, are you sort of, if you get a negative score, that tells you this isn't going in the right direction. Maybe you ought to backtrack and try a new strategy. And you do this over and over again until you start discovering a winning strategy that allows you to get a sequence of positive scores that then allows you to optimize your game. And so in the example I just described, basically I described a vision of like learning from interacting with the environment. The challenge is you can't really learn from interacting with patients, or you can to some extent, but it's really dangerous to do experiments. It's unethical to do experiments with the environment. But you can use the similar approach of learning from temporal data or time course data of interactions by watching historical data of other time course interactions that has happened in the environment. So in this analogy, it would be as though you got a chance to watch millions of robots trying to walk. And you got to watch like what they were doing, what was the score, what were they doing, what was the score, and then you basically backtrack from there to figure out what's the right thing to do. And so that's effectively an example of being able to use large amounts of data intuitively, at an intuitive level, this notion of like learning from data. And there isn't, a lot of the kinds of techniques people talk about are sort of, quote, deep learning kind of classification techniques, which is basically, you have a set of large number of inputs. We heard earlier today on multiple talks, like large number of inputs, you put it in and you have one output. But learning from data is a much more flexible framework from that. There are many, many different ways of learning from unsupervised data, semi-supervised data, partially supervised data, but also like learning with noisy data where you get reward over a long period of time or you get feedback over a long period of time. So roughly, that's kind of the framework where the question is, if we had millions of patients, can we learn from it? And if so, let me sort of, for the purpose of making this a fun talk, here's an example of a robot actually using what I just described and learning. This is a simulation, but it's a real robot actuator learning over time. And as it's getting more and more data, you can see in the beginning it was totally incompetent. And look at that. As it's like getting more and more data, and it's learning to fall, get up, et cetera. Now you can see it's this time around it's gonna go. And this is sort of what you get from learning over time versus like a system where you might learn. Like this is 10, 15 years ago, what our systems used to look like. Basically like barely, like this is a team of large number of people who would sit there and instrument it. And the challenge was that, effectively we would build in all these rules. So the point being, this idea of how do you flexibly learn from data, how do you learn? So this whole science, like, so in medicine, we very much think of it as like the deep learning machine AI learning tool exists. Now it's a matter of taking it and just boom, applying it. And sort of more broadly, this whole apparatus of like learning from complicated data to figure out what is the right way to learn, what do we want to learn, and how do we combine what we know with what's in the data is very, very powerful. And it really is, like, I think, going to be a pretty dramatic shift in sort of the delivery of medicine, because it now allows us to take advantage of, like, a lot of the kind of digital data that Jeff was talking about that's getting collected. So here in this, labs and physiology, and not just one patient, but millions of patients. And the question is, how do you integrate them? So here in this case, you could imagine basically, so I'm going to apply that paradigm here, just sort of continuing down the analogy. You have all this data in the bottom coming in, and you've got to like build that little program, or what we are calling a detector in this image, in order to output, when it's green means, hey, I'm concerned. When it's not green, I'm not concerned. And the star is when an episode is happening, so you want to anticipate it. And on the right, I'm sort of drawing the analogy where your goal, what's your goal here? You want to optimize the user's objective, which is you don't want to alert so frequently that you falsely alert all over the place, but you also want to early detect. So you can write that in math. So that's your goal. And your move, what are your moves? Move is alert or wait and watch. And then what's your score? It's basically, if you alert a lot falsely, then that's a negative score, right? And then based on that, you could learn from this kind of data in order to be able to understand for any given individual what are the markers that matter in order to be able to forecast. And then, like I described, like an early example of showing that this can be done, and ways in which we can continue to improve the learning in order to make this more and more precise. So let's talk a little bit about what are the hard what are the hard bits as we've been taking it to the bedside. So I feel like, there's been like plethora, like we really, like one of the super exciting things that's happened in the last 5 years is many, many different areas of medicine are beginning to see how this idea of learning from data can be powerful and useful in adding new knowledge into our field and in developing point-of-care tools. The challenge is very, very few of them, and Eric's written sort of this beautiful review paper recently, and I edited for PLOS Medicine a whole issue on machine learning in healthcare. And the challenge is there are no examples, very few examples of things that have actually made it to the bedside. Now you might say, hey, come on. It takes 17 years to get a drug from an idea to market, so why do you think it should be any different here? And to be fair, you're right. But hey, guess what? The people who work in this field are very ambitious, and they like working hard. So what I want to sort of talk about is like the next step. So where do we go from here? So here's the deal. If you think of clinicians and their perception of technology and anything related to technology, and in particular all things related to data that leads to any kind of distraction or attention-grabbing mechanism within their workflow, in their EMR, on their phone, this is sort of the expression, internally how they feel, even though they're being polite in front of you. And so the question is, like, how do we think about that? And so that's sort of been the thing that I think is sort of the next frontier we need to be pushing really hard. And I'll sort of talk about some of my, like, very simple, I only have 20 minutes, so some early lessons from having been out in the field for about, like 2.5 years, but also watching other experiments, other people attempting and seeing, a couple of things that have worked and not worked. So the first thing is, it really matters what you're trying to implement. So for instance, if your goal was to implement an fMRI machine, which has a very clear a protocol for how you're going to act, then you need to do what is necessary to support the protocol. So not all protocols require that you understand in gory details everything that is necessary to enable the protocol. So in other words, when we collaborate, so I kind of think of this notion of, so we've been working on this notion of like human-machine teaming. Like, how do you think about, how can we as a field enable human-machine teaming where the data is like, from learning from the data, we're discovering facts that matter. It's like having another trusted colleague, right? And they're discovering for you something that's relevant. The question is, when is it that you're able to collaborate and work with the colleague versus when are you not? And often the ones you're able to collaborate with are the ones where you have some notion of predictability. You understand how they work. You understand, you have a model for collaboration. You understand, you have an interface, if you will, of understanding how to go back and forth. And there's some notion of transparency. In other words, you can sort of build a model of trust over time by understanding how they behave when they behave. So the question is then, how do we enable these kinds of, like, what are these fundamental principles and how do we enable these in order, and especially if AI isn't just doing black box diagnostics, but they're moving towards the kind of example I spoke about where we will need collaboration, in the sense that what we found is that, it is only possible, like typical state-of-the-art detectors at the moment, like typical majority of detectors are more like 1 in 10. That means 1 in 10 cases detected are truly septic. From pushing some of the principles I'll show you next, it's possible to have gotten to about 1 in 3, means 1 in 3 are correct, which means it's nowhere near a point where it's possible to put just sort of closed loop, no human involved in getting this to happen. And then as soon as an expert is involved, the question is, you're hoping to augment them. And so the question is, what is the right principle, paradigm for augmentation? And so how do we build these in it? So that's sort of one thing we need to be thinking about. So the second aspect is this idea that we very frequently use AUCs, right? So AUCs are like classically the common paradigm for measuring accuracy. But turns out, actually, when you go out in the field, not all errors are created equal. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance over some errors, and so it's that version of, when you form a mental model of a colleague, they say some wise things and then they say some really stupid things, and you're sort of wondering, like, what is going on? So it's that same thing, right? If it claims to be intelligent, it shouldn't do dumb things. But it's interesting that what is dumb and not so dumb to a human is very different from dumb and not so dumb to a machine, and it's especially interesting because our AUCs, like the objective functions we use, like the objective metrics we're using, which is AUC sensitive, don't optimize for what is dumb and not dumb. They're optimizing for a pretty blunt metric. So how do you think about that? And in that context, this notion of, like, I'll give you one example. So here's creatinine is a molecule in the body. It gets filtered out by your kidneys. It's a waste molecule. And so the idea is, if your kidneys are functioning really well, it should basically be able to filter it out. That means your creatinine levels should read at a certain level. But it can happen that, let's say, if you get septic, sepsis starts impacting your kidneys, which it often does, then your kidneys will start malfunctioning, which means your creatinine level will go up. That means creatinine going up is a sign of, often sort of like an early stage sign of potentially sepsis happening. On the other hand, there are 6 other things that make creatinine go up. For instance, if you have chronic kidney disease, or that you just had a nephrotoxic medication that is causing you to make your kidneys go up. Now, this is an example where if you didn't have this context, you said, this person is septic, the person looks, and they say, this person just has chronic kidney disease. Couldn't you see that? That's an example of, like, not all errors created equal, and this lack of context and confounders kind of in practice what we found to really, like, reduce trust. And then a third example here is this notion of, like, sort of what I call data heterogeneity and missingness, and how that sort of kills trust. So here in this case, again, also Jeff showed several examples like this. When you're aggregating data like this, very different from Framingham risk score, where you could say, I need these 15 things. You're going to measure these 15 things. You're going to measure them at this pace. End of story, right? Here, people are measuring things. They're measuring it, at very different granularities. Different tests are being measured for different reasons across different, in the ED, looks very different than being in the ICU, where you have a lot more data. Some patients are very sick, so you have a lot more data on them. Others you have less. So this notion of, like, data heterogeneity and missingness is huge. And so taking these classical methods that have like a one-size-fits-all approach to say, oh, you know, I'm going to have, like, I kind of think of Framingham as like a one-size-fits-all, if you will. So you can think of it as like if you don't adapt to this data heterogeneity and missingness, you'd be in grave, so we find that you'll actually get in grave trouble. It's sort of the version of like, you know, let's say imagine there's a patient for whom you have a lot of data and you integrate the markers and you say, oh, I'm really sure. Like, you know, you can be really sure on that patient, but on a different patient where you don't have as much data, it's hard to be sure. But if you're not thinking about uncertainty quantification, you're not thinking about how this missingness impacts you, then it's again that version of like, oh, I really know. Do you really know? Oh, I really know. But that's what the machine sounds like, right? When they don't think about this notion of modeling uncertainty and being, so good habits here are like an example of like how do we enable the kind of good habits that we practice in order to foster trust. And so in this example, this point being that, you know, here's an example where like there are 3 different patients, given all the data, like we're quantifying uncertainty, and then that's turning into a uncertainty estimation on the risk trajectory, which is then, you know, being used to determine, like on the right patient, it's definitely above threshold, so you might have previously said for sure they're sick. On the other hand, you're very uncertain, so you might want to wait and watch. On the left-hand side, though, you're pretty certain on these 2 patients, so you're okay to proceed. So then the final last bit, which is why does it matter? So systems like this, the thing that's exciting about this transformation that's happening is that systems like this can be tireless. They are scalable, like you can really learn from data, improve over time, and systematize the use of it at scale, which really allows you to not, you know, to reduce diagnostic errors, reduce gaps over time and introduce consistency, which is very exciting. And then third, like this ability to teach us by discovering signs and symptoms, you know, we'd have otherwise missed. I'll just say one line about this, and we can go beyond just not detection, but also understanding, can you estimate at the individual level using the same concept of learning from data? Like, can we estimate at the individual level, like, who is going to be responsive and to what degree to certain medications? So obviously, doing all of this using very noisy, messy data is tough, but there are sort of exciting work going on and like continuing to develop techniques to tease these. And this is showing data showing how much variability there is. We tend to use a one-size-fits-all approach, even in the classical prescription, forget genomics, but that there's so much variability across patients in their responsiveness levels, and especially in time-sensitive matters where you have to get the right treatment in time. If we could do something like this, it would allow us to be more aggressive. Of course, the approach isn't unique to sepsis. There's a lot of work going on in these kinds of, using this you know, in other areas, some that you've heard about today, some that are already starting to make it to the bedside in other areas like AKI, for example, and scleroderma, for example, heart failure in its early stages, and so on. So with that, I want to wrap up by saying I'm extremely excited about what I think the next 5 to 10 years is going to look like. In particular, I think the promise here is the ability to be able to augment the rate at which we learn, and how do we learn from massive, massive amounts of data? What are the kinds of techniques that will be necessary to kind of go through this messy kinds of data to be able to pull insights out? But then also we need to think about this notion of human-machine teaming and what are the right fundamentals for human-machine teaming. And with that, thank you.